The reason I like to start with guitars is because when I get to my drums and I've got some context for the drums and how I want the drums to cut through the mix, because sometimes if you start with drums and you think you've got them sounding good, but then I'll throw the guitars on and then the attack of the kick drum's like too high up and too ticky for me, or not bright enough and too dark. And it's like, well, I'm just going to have to re-EQ this. So if I start with guitars and hear what the drums are competing with roughly, because I'm not going to have final guitars, obviously, at this point. If I then have the guitars up and hearing how my drums cut through the guitars is, I think, a useful process. So yeah, that's my approach. So I'm going to dig in. So I'm going to start with these DI guitars with my plugin. Going back to the scooped mids thing, I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm going for a particularly scooped tone. My high end and low end is definitely going to peak higher than the mid range, and it's not going to look like a flat line. But it's not, I wouldn't necessarily say, oh, it sounds like Pantera scooped. But when people see me go like this on a 50-150, they're going to be like, oh, wow, it's scooped. But what's important to remember with at least the chain I'm using, there's a boogie cabinet with vintage 30 speakers with an SM57 is a ton of mid-range there. So just because I'm not getting a ton of it from the amp doesn't mean there isn't a lot of mid-range in the guitar tone, which we can see. I always like to have an EQ kind of running. I know it's not good to kind of use your eyes, but I kind of can just see instantly, like without getting ear blind, especially doing something like this where I'm not used to working on headphones. So let's start with the stomp box. This is a mimic of a Maxon OD808. I don't boost the level really. It depends on the amp. If it's a rectifier, which needs a bit more of a push and a bit more tightness, I'll go a bit higher. But a 5150 has a ton of gain, so I don't really need to like drive the amp. All this pedal is doing, I feel like it's like inherently got a low and high pass filter that kind of focuses in on around 720. So just by engaging it, it's already doing something to your low end. You don't need to necessarily boost it. And the tone, once you go past the midway point, you're actually adding high end, which I don't necessarily need either to boost. I mean, this is kind of like the sort of Andy Sneap sayings that from his forum days that I just sort of stuck with, but it definitely works with a 5150. So that's kind of what I do. And I've definitely got awesome results with the tone completely off, because this tone control is definitely not the same as the tone control on your guitar. It's not going to just sound mushy. The first Osiris record, Conclusion of an Age, we recorded with the tone like this. And I think it's a really great guitar tone. It's very thick, but it's not untight by any means. Anyway, then the drive on this pedal, if you're not familiar, it's very subtle. Like this pedal is like, before metal guitarists used to tighten up the front end of amps, was kind of just like a blues player pedal, and you kick it in, it's going to turn your Fender Twin into something with a little bit more gain, but by no means is it a distortion pedal. So I'm going to hit play. Have I got this in mono? To be honest with you, I'm going to stick with this guitar soloed in mono, but I actually always work, I don't know why, with a guitar pan to the left. Something about that is easier for me to kind of hear how it sounds, because when it's mono, I mean, you rarely listen to a guitar in mono, and I kind of just am used to hearing it either one side, one speaker. So I mean, try it for yourselves. I have no idea if there's any benefit there. So I'm going to hit play. I'm going to start with the mids there, but I'm going to bring them down. And also the high end on a 5150, I never go above 4.5 really. Again, it might look like weird settings, but I mean, these amps sound great. You can get amazing tones of them in various combinations and configurations, but there's something that I'm going to be looking for, and I'll tell you as I go. So let's listen to the riff. I've got it looped. So that's pretty much just a flat line. So we can definitely afford to lose some mids. The problem with the high end on the amp is it brings up at the same time as this is like where I want all my bite and attack to come from. But it brings up with it this 1 to 2K area, which I don't want a lot of in my guitar tone. So that's why I'm more reserved with the high control, and I'll bring up the presence, which is going to boost just general high end. I think something more like that. And it's not going to bring up the 1 to 2K area. So I'll go quite extreme with the presence. Also, anyone that owns a 6505 or a 50 on 50, this might look like I've cranked the high end, but this knob does not do anything until you get to that point. That's just how the amps function. So it might look like, oh wow, I'm actually cranking the presence. It literally does nothing until you get there on the real amp. And the plugin is meant to replicate the real amp. So that's why it doesn't do it. I can show you now. So it pretty much just kicks in when you get to that point. So I'm getting more of my high end from the presence control, less of it from the high control. The mids look like I'm completely scooped, but as we can see, the tone is by no means scooped. It doesn't look like we're like, have a huge cut anywhere in the tone. It could be a bit thicker though, and I think that's going to be mic placement is a bit too bright. Cool, so that kind of looks and sounds about right. I always like to make sure there's a bit of a roll off. I hate hearing 6K in my guitar tones. And if I get sent a guitar tone that's too bright, I will often notch it out because I feel like losing 6K just adds a hardness to the tone. When you've got too much of that brightness, your guitars sound fizzy and mushy. So I kind of look when I'm dialing in mic placement on a real cab or on the plugin to just kind of make sure I don't have much of it going on there. It's also worth noting that I don't necessarily think that what you're seeing on the plugin represents exactly the mic placement on the cab. I don't think that's an issue either. It's just use your ears with that sort of stuff. So I've kind of got that mic dialed in. I'm going to blend in a 421, which is a much more scooped mic. The problem with the 421 is it has a horrible spike at about 4.3. I'm not going to cut that though on this. I'm just going to dial in the guitar tone and then I'm going to EQ all my guitars together. And also that mic 100%. I'm just going to blend it in just a little bit because I prefer the sound of the 57. So not a lot of the 421. So I'm kind of happy with that. I think I might go just a little bit darker. Actually, I've got an EQ on there. Don't need that on. That's probably going to change things drastically. Cool. So I'm happy with that guitar tone. I'm going to copy that over. So I'm just going to paste it onto the other channels. And then I'm going to set up which I didn't do on the record. So all the guitars that I used on the record is just the exact same guitar tone, just a single 57. But all of my amps, so including my Rectifier, my Triple X, they were all in Italy getting converted into this plugin. So I would have considered blending in some different amp or a different cabinet as well for the secondary quad track guitars. So I didn't do that in the real mix. So I'm going to set that up now, the DI guitars, and see what I come up with. So I'm going to go for the Rectifier to have a different sound, hopefully fill out some different areas, and I'm going to go for a different cabinet. So as I said before, the Rectifier has a bit less gain. I can afford to drive it a bit harder, a bit more drive. The tone I'm actually going to boost up a bit just because Rectifiers are inherently a bit mushy. Q on there, turn that off. I'm going to use a different cabinet. So this is a different oversized cabinet with speakers from the year 2000. The other cab speaks from the year, 2001. The other one was the year 2000. Something that I've nerded out on, finding cabs with decent sounding speakers. I'm just going to use all 57 just whilst I'm getting the tone. So one thing I like to do is, so if it's a top left speaker, that's what TL stands for, I will go more towards the center. I never like miking on the outside of the cab it sounds a bit weird. So I always go the inward side. So I could have, if I wanted the top right speaker here, that would just mean I would mic it like that, which is what I did on the other cabinet. So top left speaker, 57, going to put it in a rough area, and then I'm going to dial in the tone on the amp and switch it to modern mode. Yep. And hit play. This might be a bit louder. So opposite to the 50 on 50, I find the presence on the rectifier too harsh, too fizzy, and too much like that 6K area that I don't like. So I usually have it pretty low. That sounds about right. I can definitely hear a cab whistle in that tone, like a which is around like 700 area. So I'm going to tackle that at some point. I'm going to throw up a 41. I don't know how much of that we're going to hear, but I've done it. So again, I'm just going to copy that over. So I'm going to quickly check the level between the main guitars and then the quieter tracks. So yeah, I'm just going to bring them up and bring these down. That kind of sounds about right in terms of the level. Sorry if I've been talking over the audio there. So yeah, just getting the levels right. So these are kind of around 5 dB quieter. I'm kind of guessing that at this point, but I'm kind of used to hearing what the difference is. So let me just check that again. Cool. And then let's listen to the entire guitar group. So I'm going to turn on the C4. This is kind of a standard setting just to tackle the low-end palm mute chug. So this is a multiband compressor. I'm only engaging it in this area between 65 and 294, very specific. And that's kind of how you want to see it working. You kind of want to only really see it ducking on the palm mutes. Any more than that might be killing a bit too much of your guitar tone. Cool. And then I can't help but look at my guitar tone as I'm going, but I'm going to EQ with like an SSL style strip. I'm going to add some high end, and I'm going to add a very horrible area of probably around 3K, which is exactly where all of the bite and the aggression is for guitar tones that I like. It's just annoying that that's the area with all the horrible, harsh, whistly frequencies, which we might have to look at later. I got to a point where I really just want to nail the guitar tone as close as I can with the source tones. Really subtle EQ moves and broad EQ moves instead of just drawing some crazy thing in on Pro Q3 and notching everything. But we'll see how we go. So yeah, just bringing up some of this high end. I don't feel the need to low pass filter this tone with this type of cabinet. It really depends on the cabinet. If you've got like a Marshall at 16 ohms and maybe doesn't have vintage 30s, you might definitely want to be, low passing it, but it really depends on the cab. I'm not seeing a ton of information here, so I actually want to bring it up because this is like you can't always necessarily hear this in the mix when you're boosting this area, but it just adds to the excitement for me. So I'm going to bring up some of that kind of teethy bite area now. I can hear a whistle happening. I just know where it is, and I can tell that it's at 2.3. I can see it. We'll get to that later. I'm going to bring up some low end. I'm actually going to bring up a lot of low mids as well to kind of even out and to get some more of the note area, which is usually in this area between 300 to 400. But I also feel like amp sims don't necessarily always have a lot of that low end sub. So I'm just going to bring up like a low shelf and bring up the whole area. And then this woofy palm mute area, I'm going to tackle in Pro Q3. Cool. So I'm going to kind of this problem area that we've already compressed with the C4. I'm going to use an instance of dynamic EQ to pretty much do the same thing, but also just carve it out as well. So two areas that I can hear. The main that's really whistling and bothering me is 2.3. I can just hear it. And this area here around 700 is like this kind of low whistle that kind of sounds like a hairdryer in the background of your tone. I am going to do a high pass just because we've got a lot of low end going on there. But yeah, I find, I can't remember if I said this to Joel before we started streaming or if I've said it on air, but a problem that I think happens is when guitarists low pass too much and the only low end you're left with is the muddy area. And if you just carve it out and then leave some of the subbier area, and it has just a more of a, I think, pleasing sound. This isn't going to be the final tone. I want to get guitars just roughly where I want to mix them. That is a 5150 and a rectifier, two different cabinets going to one group.